Hey y'all, so welcome to our next unit where we're going to talk all about how to display data and describe it. So today we're going to look specifically at categorical data, how to read and interpret graphs, but also how to create graphs, or at least how to create good graphs. So we're going to first talk about symbols. So this is more related to data as a whole. We're continuing our conversation of, the types of data that we have, as well as what statistics versus parameters look like. So we need to know some symbols in statistics because this will kind of help things a little bit more down the line. So we have parameters and we have statistics. If you remember from last unit, parameter is what is true for the entire population, and a statistic is what is true for the sample. You can remember that because parameter, population start with an S, statistic and sample start with an S. So I'm going to create this little table to help us keep track of our symbols. There are 4 symbols that we need to know and be able to recognize easily for the 4 different things you see here. So firstly, we have on the side parameter versus statistic, because the symbol that we use is different if we're dealing with population value versus a sample value. And then we have on the top means versus proportions. So that's if our data is numerical, we're going to be interested in the mean or the average. And then if our data is categorical, we're going to be interested in the proportion or the percent of that data, which is a certain value. So if we're dealing with numerical data and we're looking at the average of something, the symbol I use for my population parameter is this symbol right here, which is a Greek letter. It is mu. Kind of looks like a U with just a little long piece at the beginning. I usually draw it like a U and just kind of start lower on that left side. So mu is that symbol. And that's again for the population parameter if it's a numerical value or mean. If that mean is describing what is true for the sample, the symbol I use looks like this. It is an X with a line over it. We call this X bar. X with a line over it, X bar. So if that mean, that value that I'm looking at is what is true for the sample, I use X bar. If my data is categorical, which means I'm looking for the percent of something, what percent of people are wearing a red shirt, what percent of people know how to drive, etc. My population parameter, the symbol I use is just a regular old letter P. Just letter P for proportion is how you can think of it. And then if our data that we're dealing with, or if that particular number is true for the sample, the symbol we use is P, but with a little thing over it. We call this a hat, so this is P hat. And that is the symbol we use. So a couple of hints, because you do need to know which symbol is used and when, and you'll start seeing this show up on questions, on tests and quizzes and homeworks, etc. So a couple of hints. Firstly, notice that my sample symbols both have something on top of them. So a little silly saying that I use sometimes is that stats wear hats. So the statistic symbols both have a symbol or something on top of the letter, so stats wear hats. Which notice that both of the proportion symbols have a P in it, so you can think of P for proportion, and that's another way to remember it. So this is something you'll have to remember. You'll see this on quizzes and tests, and I'll kind of remind you of it as we go. This table is a really good thing to draw in your notes to refer back to until you do get used to knowing which symbols are used when. So now let's talk about categorical variables. So when we talk about any variable, the first thing we can have is to display that variable is called a distribution. A distribution is basically just the name of the categories and how frequently each one occurs. Distributions can be for categorical data or numerical data, but you're probably more used to seeing it with categorical data, and it looks something like this. It's just a table. So the table is telling us how many answered each thing and how many people answered each category. So this survey question was, what is your preferred method of communication? It was asked to high school students somewhere, sometime. So we have cell phone, Facebook, in-person, text message, and total. And we have the number who answered each response as well as the total number of people. So that is called a frequency distribution. Again, it basically just tells us what are the categories or what are the survey responses, and then how many said each one. We could also have that number in percentages, and we would call this a relative frequency distribution. Relative frequency is percentage instead of just plain old number. So a table is one way that we have of taking our raw data, which is really just a whole bunch of words for all of the different people in our population or sample, and putting it into a more organized format, like a table that is easy for us to read and kind of pick information from. From there, we can take our table and turn it into some type of graph. So this is an example of a bar graph, and you might be tempted in your very creative minds to create bar graphs that are like visually interesting and use different symbols or different pictures to represent the bars. Where we have to be careful with something like this is that this is a lot to look at. So we have a cell phone representing the people who said cell phone. The cell phone is up to 4, so telling us 4. Facebook is 2, in person is 6, and then text message is 8. So yeah, we have pictures and it's creative. The problem is that we are kind of more taken up by the area of each picture. So notice that the width and height changes instead of just the height. Plus, the pictures themselves are very distracting. So that is not necessarily a good bar graph that we would want to draw. When we draw bar graphs, we want to stick with something a little bit more simple because that allows us to really take in the difference in height, and we can very quickly and easily read the information that we're given in this bar graph. So a bar chart or a bar graph displays our distribution of a categorical variable, showing the counts for each category next to each other for easy comparison. I have my y-axis representing the number in each category, and then of course my x-axis is representing the category itself. Okay, a good bar chart stays true to something we call the area principle, which is that the width stays the same, only the height is changing, so that our eyes are more focused on the difference in height and are really not concerned about the width of the bars. If we go back to that last one, right, the width and height are changing, so it looks a lot bigger than what it really is, and we're distracted by the picture. So that is a bar graph, something that will come in later when we talk about numerical data. For bar graphs or bar charts, we want to make sure that we leave space between the categories because on numerical data, we have something that kind of looks like a bar graph but doesn't have space in between. So that is to differentiate it. We could also do a relative frequency bar graph, which is the same idea, but instead of numbers along our y-axis, we put percentages. So the percent of people who said cell phone, Facebook, in-person, and text message would be another way. This would be good if we had a table that gave us percentages, or if we were just more interested in visually displaying the percentages. If that was something we wanted to do, we could do that. So I have percents instead of numbers. Notice that the graph didn't really change a whole lot from what it looked like before, right? The bars don't really look a whole lot different. All that really changes the y-axis, but that is definitely allowable for bar graphs. Another way that we have to represent categorical data is with a pie chart. So pie chart or circle chart is drawn like a circle, and then we have the percent of each section displayed visually by what percent of the circle is taken up. When you're interested in parts of a whole, a pie chart might work for that. We can kind of very clearly, our eyes are kind of trained to see or to look at pie charts and decide what section of it. We can very easily see what is half, what is a quarter, etc. Be really, really careful. Pie charts are only good when you're looking at the distribution of one variable for one population. This wouldn't work if we had more than one population that we were trying to put into one pie chart because the percents are going to be all messed up. So we have to be careful there. So again, this is a good way to look at the relative frequencies in comparison with each other. It's really easy to see like, oh, this group had twice as much percent as the other group. They're twice as likely to like text messages compared to cell phone. Bad pie charts would be anything that contains too much information. So pie charts should be easy to read. The whole point of graphing your data is to make it easy to read and understand. So your parts of the whole should be easily measured or estimated based on the size of the section. So one example of a bad pie chart are these really cool looking 3D ones, but when they do the 3D to the point where it's almost like flat, you can't really see visually the true like percentage each section takes up. So this back section looks about the same percent as this front section up here, the blue one in the back and the red one in the front. But really, the one on the back is supposed to be much bigger, but it's really hard for us to see that visually, so we have to be careful. This is another example. They were trying to be cool and like make it look like a little slice of something, but it's just really visually confusing, and it's hard for our eyes to truly read it as what it should be. And then, of course, if we just have way too much information to the point where I'm not going to take the time to read all of those and then go find the corresponding color, it's too much. We have to be careful about things like that. So now let's move into, those are different types of pie charts or bar graphs or graphs in general that we can use. We'll look at another couple in a minute. But a lot of what you're going to be doing, more so than drawing graphs, you might have to draw bar graphs or pie charts occasionally, probably bar graphs more than pie charts. But more than that, you're going to need to know how to describe the data you see. So the big thing, the big hint I want to give you when we are describing categorical data is to be very careful that you are looking at what your y-axis is giving you. So for this one, it's saying a bar graph showing the percentage of drivers who wear their seatbelts in each of the 4 regions. So just to clarify, this means that this is the percent of people in the Northeast who say that they wear seatbelts while driving. This is the percent of Midwest. So you'll notice our percents don't add up to 100. That's because this is not the percent of the entire US. It's the percent within each region that wear seatbelts. So we have to read carefully. So if you were asked a question that said, in which region do the greatest number of people wear seatbelts? We have to be careful because we don't know for sure about the number, because what we have on our y-axis is percentages. So unless we were told how many people are in each region or how many people were surveyed in each region, we can't really answer questions about number. So if I were describing what I see on this graph, a good rule of thumb is to talk about similarities and talk about differences, talk about overall patterns that you see. So I could say that overall the bar chart shows that all 4 regions have over 60% of drivers wearing seatbelts. Again, I'm saying percent and not numbers because that's what I know based on the graph. If I was told how many were in each region, then I could be more specific with numbers. But since all I know is percentages, I just say percent. So that's kind of my overall. More than 50%, 60% of each region have drivers wearing seatbelts. I could say that the Midwest has the smallest proportion or percent of drivers wearing seatbelts at about 62, whereas the South and West have the largest proportion of percent at around 78 to 80%. So that would be how I could describe, again, looking for those overall patterns and then looking at similarities and differences between your categories. Again, notice that we're using the word proportion or percent, not the word number, because in this case, I don't know anything about the numbers. If I did know something about the numbers, I could talk about the numbers. So if we were then taking a categorical variable and wanting to compare it between 2 or 3 or 4 groups, we could also do that using a graph. So a psychologist, and this is our example for this, psychologist asked 100 5-year-olds and 50 10-year-olds to name their favorite color, and the results are shown in this table. So we have red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and purple as options, or maybe those were just the colors that the 5-year-old and 10-year-olds mentioned. They weren't very specific. It's hard to tell whether they really just used these 6 colors or if the psychologist gave them options that were these 6 colors, or if he like generally put them in groups. But either way, here's our data for 5-year-olds and 10-year-olds. So we can make a bar graph with groups. We call this a side-by-side bar graph. Basically, we have our categories of colors on the bottom, same as we might have before, and we have our numbers on the y-axis. But now we have 2 little bars for each color, one for 5-year-olds, one for 10-year-olds. So I can see that a whole lot of 5-year-olds liked red, whereas only like 7 or 8 of the 10-year-olds liked red. So we can kind of compare each color within the 2 groups and make those visual comparisons. We could also look at percentages. So this is that same data, but looking at percentages. And this is percentage of each age group. So now I can see that for the 5-year-old age group, a little over 0.2 or 20% of the 5-year-olds liked red, whereas more like 14% of the 10-year-olds liked red, right? I can see that 35-ish% of the 5-year-olds liked blue, whereas only like 22, 23% of the 10-year-olds liked blue. So I'm looking at percentages instead of numbers. So I could talk, if I was given this graph, I could talk about the differences and comparisons with the percentages. The other graph that I can make with, and this is not something that I'm going to ask you to make right now. We'll talk more in a couple of units on how we actually draw these. But another thing that I can make with two variables is something we call a segmented bar graph. So a segmented bar graph is basically like taking the information you would put on a pie chart and then just turning it into a bar instead of a circle. So I've just taken the big circle and I put it into a bar. And I did that for 5-year-olds and 10-year-olds. So 5-year-olds had about this much red, favorite color red, this much was favorite color orange, yellow, green, blue, and purple. And then I did the same for 10-year-olds. So notice that both bars go up to 100% because that's 100% of the sample who like each color. So I can kind of, with something like this, I can really easily compare between two groups. So I can see that, a much larger percent of 5-year-olds liked blue compared to 10-year-olds. With 10-year-olds, a much bigger percent of them liked green compared to 5-year-olds. So I'm able to compare like between the two groups a little bit better when I'm looking at the percentages between the two groups. So a segmented bar graph, something like this, just allows us to look at percentages, but compare them specifically between two groups. I can do that with two pie charts, but here's the thing. Pie charts are harder to draw. It's hard. It takes a little bit more time. If you want to get the segments perfectly right, we have to talk about like geometry a little bit. And plus they're a little bit more juvenile. Statisticians just tend not to use pie charts a whole lot. We tend to use bar graphs a little bit more. So it's the same information that would be in two pie charts. We just put them as bars. You'll see these a lot on questions that they want you to get information from. So it's good to be able to look at this and visualize what it's telling us. The last little piece we're going to look at is just making sure that you know how to find percentages and things like that from data that you're given. So here we have our same table from before, 5-year-olds, 10-year-olds, and then the different colors that they said that they liked as their favorite. And we're going to answer some questions asking us to find certain percentages. So the first thing you might want to do, if it's not already done for you, is to go ahead and find the totals. So the totals for each row and each column, these are called the marginal distributions. And if you look at the totals, but basically this just helps us with some calculations. So there were 100 5-year-olds and there were 50 10-year-olds. And we can also see the number of people who liked all the different colors. So once I do that, I can start answering questions such as this. So what percent of the 5-year-olds chose red as their favorite color? So if I'm looking at my 5-year-olds, 21 of them chose red out of 100 5-year-olds total. So of the 5-year-olds means I only care about 5-year-olds. Right now, I'm only looking at that top row. 21 chose red out of 100 total, which would be 0.21 or 21%. What percent of 10-year-olds chose purple as their favorite color? So now I only care about 10-year-olds. So of the 10-year-olds means I only care about that bottom row. 8 chose purple out of 50 total. So 8 out of 50, which is 0.16 or 16%. And then if I ask what percent of all the children or of children chose green as their favorite color. So of children means I care about both 5 and 10-year-olds. So total, we had 25 chose green out of total 150. So 25 out of 150, which is 16.67%. So looking at questions like this that are asked to you, we are looking at the word of. The word of is kind of telling you your total. That's the number that should go on the bottom. So those are some good clues. So looking at those and reading carefully to figure out percentages based on a table. And then you might see questions like this that are multiple choice, where they give you a lot of options and you really just have to take the time to write things down and figure out percentages to find the one that matches. So this one's the same data that we had before. Which of the following statements is supported by the table? And we have some options. So I'm going to pause this for a minute. Go ahead and figure out what your answer would be. So basically, when I go through each of these answer choices one by one to look at what percents are in each area, A is the answer that is true. The percentage of 5-year-olds who selected red or blue as their favorite color is greater than the percentage of 10-year-olds who selected red or blue. So for 5-year-olds, red or blue, 21 and 35 is 56. So 56 out of 100 is 56%. And then for 10-year-olds, it's 7 plus 12, which is 19 out of 50, which is 38%. So it is greater for 5-year-olds than it is for 10-year-olds. Again, we can kind of go through that same process for the other options and find that all of these other options do not work out mathematically. So A is the correct answer. And that is all we're going to talk about right now for categorical data. See you later.